preserved, for I walk in this world. They reside.
It's my pleasure to be with you this evening. This is my second time to be in this church building. A few years ago, Miriam, who's sitting right over here, she and I came down to tour Alabama, and as part of that, Will Sharp showed us around the church building here. And Will was a student of mine at Heritage, so we knew each other before that. But so, second time to be here, and thank you for the opportunity and the invitation. I have finished reading a novel. Let me tell you about this novel. It's called Silence. I wonder if any of y'all have read it or seen the movie. The movie came out like 10 years ago. Martin Scorsese directed it. Liam Neeson, Andrew Garfield, Adam Driver. So you got some big movie stars in that movie. Now, it's not a fun movie to watch. I watched the movie probably the year it came out, 2016, on a flight to the Philippines. So I watched the movie on an airplane. Not the ideal way to watch any movie, but it was a powerful movie even on an airplane. Well, just recently, then, a couple of weeks ago, really, I finished reading the novel. The novel, it's a Japanese novel. The author, I am sure to butcher his name, Shusaku Endo. 1966, he wrote this novel. Translated into English, 1969. Let me tell you about the novel, just real quick. And will I give away, spoiler alert, I suppose? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if you were planning on reading the novel or watching the movie anytime soon, but spoilers are probably coming. It's a novel about Christian missionaries going to Japan in the 17th century. Christian missionaries first went to Japan in the 16th century, and they had a great deal of success in Japan, spreading the gospel, converting people, building church buildings. The political leaders in Japan welcomed in these missionaries and supported their efforts in the 16th century. There was a lot of freedom of movement for the Christian missionaries in Japan. But sometime in the 17th century, and I'm thinking of, we're talking about like 1625, somewhere in there, the political leaders of Japan decided this was not what they wanted to encourage. They did not want to encourage this foreign Western religion and the spread of it in Japan. And so they put the stop to it. They started persecuting the Christians that were there and the foreign missionaries. The novel concerns a couple of missionaries. They're from Portugal. And they, about 1639, I think is when, and it's based on true events. About 1639, these Portuguese missionaries go to Japan, not so much to spread the gospel, not so much to build the kingdom of God in Japan, but because they're on a mission to find someone that they had known, this former missionary, and they want to go find him. So the novel concerns these particular missionaries who go, but the point is they go into Japan after it is already clear, we don't want you here. The novel is called Silence. These missionaries go into Japan and they expect to face persecution, and that expectation is not disappointed. And eventually the main character, this Portuguese missionary named, I think his name is Rodriguez, he is captured. And most of the novel, so far I haven't given any spoilers, because most of the novel is about him being in Japanese captivity and how that process goes. And whether or not the Japanese can figure out a way to get him to renounce his faith in Christ. What will get that job done? The Japanese political leaders wonder to themselves. How can we do it? What if we torture him this way? What if we torture him that way? What if we do this to the people that he loves? At what point will he be willing to renounce his faith in Christ? Well, I said the movie is not an easy movie to watch. The novel is not an easy novel to read. And I don't know if I have painted a picture of a novel like, I gotta read that. But it is thought-provoking. We're talking about Daniel tonight. Daniel, at a very early time in his life, is captured. Not so much, I think, captured because of his faith, but captured because he's a part of this political organization called Judea. And Nebuchadnezzar brings his Babylonian army into Judea, and they capture a great deal of the Judean people, and they just carry them over into Babylon. And they plunk them down, and that's where they're going to live out their lives. This is the beginning of what we know from studying the Bible is called the exile. And we can even put a date on it. The exile, we usually date it to like 597 BC or so. The temple in Jerusalem was eventually destroyed by these same people, the Babylonians. That we can put a date on that as well, 586 BC. The temple is destroyed. But Daniel and his friends, you know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are taken captive, and we read about them in chapter 1. And a great deal of the book of Daniel is about what are the situations in which you might renounce your faith. Are there those situations? And I'll tell you what, when you read the book of Daniel, most of the Jews who go into captivity, they are ready. There are situations in which they say, yes, I'll renounce my faith. I'll do it. Chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar has this big statue set up, and he says, whenever you hear musical instruments, you're going to bow down before my statue. A violation, if we're thinking about the Ten Commandments, a violation of what? How many of them? But at least number 1 and number 2, right? And by all appearances, Nebuchadnezzar plays his musical instruments, and just all the Jews decide, hey, I'll bow down to that statue. Sure, does it? Because the threat is fiery furnace. If it's bow down to the statue or go into the fiery furnace, I'll bow down to the statue. Yes, I'm ready to renounce my faith. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are the ones who say, no, that's not for us. We're not going to do that. There's a story a few chapters later. That's chapter 3. Chapter 6 is a story about the lion's den, where the command from the king, this king is named Darius, he says that no one should pray to anyone except to me for a period of 30 days. And apparently most people are like, sure, I'll do that. I will obey that law. And Daniel is the one that we read about in Daniel chapter 6 who says, no, that's not for me. You haven't yet found the situation in which I am willing to renounce my faith. We have all of these famous stories. I think we know them. I mean, we don't know any of them as well as we know the two I've already mentioned. The fiery furnace in chapter 3 and the lion's den in chapter 6. But all of those early chapters in Daniel, we know them pretty well. We don't know the handwriting on the wall as well. That's chapter 5, but we know it. It's pretty familiar to us. Chapter 4 with Nebuchadnezzar and the dream about the tree that is chopped down, and this symbolizes that Nebuchadnezzar himself is going to live in the wilderness for a period of time. We know that one pretty well. Chapter 2 is the story about another dream of Nebuchadnezzar about a statue with different metals, and it is destroyed. And then chapter 1, of course, is the story. We'll look at chapter 1 again in more detail in just a bit, but it's a story about Daniel and his friends refusing to eat the king's food. And all of these stories present this crisis moment. Is this the time when you're ready to renounce your faith? Is this it? Has the pressure upon you come enough when you're ready to conform to society? That's the first 6 chapters. They're pretty familiar to us. The last 6 chapters are not all that familiar. I think these last 6 chapters are apocalyptic visions, but if anything, the pressure is intensified in the last 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. Now, I will tell you that, and maybe you do have experience reading these last 6 chapters, but they are weird visions, and if you haven't read them in a while, let me just remind you that the last 6 chapters of the book of Daniel are a lot like the book of Revelation. If you're familiar with the book of Revelation, you sort of know how that works with the weird visions and the beasts and all kinds of weird stuff going on, blood flowing and all weird stuff happening. That's Daniel chapters 7 through 12. Same sort of thing. So it can be difficult to understand what exactly is going on, but what is not difficult to understand is bad things are going on. That's pretty clear. That's pretty much on the surface. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. Well, this is Daniel chapter 8. So this is the second of the apocalyptic visions in the second half of the book of Daniel. It starts out as a vision about a goat, and then there's a ram, and they get into a fight with one another. And then an angel comes and explains to Daniel what this is all about. And this is what it says. This is verse 18. And as he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. Then he touched me and set me on my feet. He said, "Listen, and I will tell you what will take place later." Listen to this. "In the period of wrath. For it refers to the appointed time of the end." And then he goes on. He explains it to us a little bit. "As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece. The great horn between its eyes is the first king." I'll just stop reading there, and we can already get some idea of at least the historical time period in which this vision is supposed to be referring to. We've got Media and Greece, that's the ram, and then the goat is Greece, and there's a horn in the middle of that goat's head, and that is the first great king. Okay, we know that guy. That's Alexander the Great, right? The great king of Greece, that's Alexander the Great. So we are talking about that sort of time period, and if we know much about history, we might know that Alexander the Great, he is the guy that defeated the Persian Empire. Okay, so that's sort of tracking with what's going on here. But the angel had said to Daniel, this is about the period of wrath. And that's what the vision is then going to describe about this time. I can skip down to verse 23, for instance. At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. A king of bold countenance. You know what? We actually know the name of this guy too. This king of bold countenance. So just track with me. We've got Greece, and we've got Alexander the Great. But if you read, it says that the horn is broken off. So we know Alexander the Great. He's now dead. And if we know anything about Alexander the Great, we probably know he died very early. He was not quite 33 years old. And his empire split up. And so that's the period in that we're talking about. So we've got these Greek kings. And this one particular guy in verse 23, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. So it keeps going. This is a bad guy. We know who this guy is. From history, we can identify him. I can give you his name. I want to give you his name. It's Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. This is a guy that ruled in Judea. He came to the throne about 175 BC. And he died in 164 BC. So he reigned for 11, 12 years, right in there. The book of Daniel is really interested in telling us about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. I say that because it's right here in chapter 8. He comes up again. He might come up a few other places, but at least he comes up again in chapter 11. Let me point out to you where he is in chapter 11. Verse 21. This is again a long vision about all these different kings that are going to come to the throne among these Greek kingdoms. And look at verse 21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom through intrigue and army. It just keeps going. It goes on for about 20 verses talking about this one particular king. This is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Why is the book of Daniel so interested in letting us know about this guy, Antiochus IV Epiphanes? I'll tell you why. Because he is the first king in history, not the last, but the first, who outlawed the practice of Judaism. We have historical accounts about this particular fellow, who the year was, he came to the throne in 175 BC, but we got to wait till about 168 BC, and he outlaws Judaism. What do I mean? Outlaws Judaism? This is what I mean. He starts telling people that he will put them to death if they circumcise their sons. If you own a copy of the Torah, death. If you keep the Sabbath, death. He hauls up. There are some very famous stories. Some of you have probably heard these stories. Very famous stories about how Antiochus gathers up these pious Jews and tries to force them to eat pork. He knows if I can get them to eat pork, what can I do to get them to renounce their faith? Well, Antiochus knows if I can get them to eat pork, that's what it is. If I threaten torture enough, maybe they will eat pork, and that is good enough for me. That will mean they have renounced their faith. If they will just put that pork in their mouth, that's renouncing the faith. And so he hauls up the one story where he gathers together these 7 brothers. They're all part of the same family. These 7 brothers and their mother. And he talks to the oldest. Antiochus is there. This is in Jerusalem, and he talks to that oldest boy. It doesn't say how old he is. In my own mind, he's like 20 years old, something like that. And he talks to him and he says, "You eat the pork, or else I'm going to torture you in a very excruciating way." I mean, it's described. I feel like I shouldn't describe it to you in this context. I don't know, it's gross. You eat the pork, and the boy says, basically, not a chance. No way I'm going to eat that pork. I'm going to stay true to my God. I will hold on to the law of my God, and I'm not going to conform to whatever it is you want me to conform to. You just can't do it. You don't have the power to get me to renounce my faith. That first boy is then executed in a very gruesome way. Boy number 2 comes up, the second oldest boy, and again, the officials are talking to him about, just do it. Just eat this, or you're going to die in the same way as your brother. And again, I think this is the boy who responds to the king, "You don't have a fire hot enough to get me to play the coward." And so again, he's executed. Boy number 3, boy number 4, boy number 5, boy number 6. All executed as their mother is standing there watching. Finally, Antiochus turns to the mama. Says, "Listen, you've just seen 6 of your sons die. You've got 1 left. Talk some sense into it." And the mama turns to her youngest son. The text says that she speaks in Hebrew so the king can't understand. And the mama says to this boy, "Have pity on me." The first words out of her mouth in Hebrew to this boy, "Have pity on me." And you think, I as a reader think, she's going to tell him to eat the pork. What she's going to tell him is, "I can't lose all 7 of my sons in one day. Eat the pork. We'll deal with it later. We'll just ask for forgiveness later." That's not what the mama says. The mama looks at this youngest boy and she says, "Have pity on me. And remember the lessons I raised you in. Remember the law of your God, and do not give up in the face of this brutal tyrant." And that youngest boy responds with this beautiful speech to the king. Basically says, "Get lost." He suffers martyrdom. And then the mama also is put to death. That's who we're talking about. Antiochus Epiphanes. There are these famous stories about the torture that he brought on people. What can I do to get them to renounce their faith? The book of Daniel is interested in forcing us to think through those issues. What would it mean for me to be in that situation? What if I lived in the period of wrath? What if I were faced with the fiery furnace? When everybody around me is bowing down, what would I do in that situation? What if I were faced with this ridiculous, absurd law about only praying to the king for an entire month on pain of death being thrown to the lions? What would I do in that situation? The book of Daniel is interested in forcing those questions upon us. Am I only willing to live faithfully as long as it's easy? As long as life is comfortable? As long as there's no opposition? What would I do in the situation of that missionary in Japan in the 17th century? What would I do if I were those 7 boys or that mama? What would I do if I were Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? How would I respond in that situation? Daniel chapter 1 is an interesting chapter because it doesn't necessarily fit the image of the book of Daniel that I have just constructed for you. The image of the book of Daniel that I've just constructed for you is this pressure on us. This question bears down upon us. Are we really people of faith? What kind of faith do we really have? But the book of chapter 1 doesn't quite fit that same storyline. Maybe. Chapter 1 is the chapter that introduces us, of course, to these characters. Nebuchadnezzar comes over. He gets these young boys. He gets others as well. He carries them over to Babylon. And these particular boys, they are royal boys. They are a part of the royal household in Judea. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are a part of the king's family. That's what it tells us in Daniel chapter 1. I think it's verse 3. I've got it in verse 3. Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility. And so that's why they're picked out. We can presume, now you, just from guessing from the book of Daniel, it must be the case that Daniel, these young men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are pretty young. I don't know, it doesn't tell us, but I'm thinking 16 to 20 or younger. I wouldn't think they could be possibly much older than 20. I say that, this is the reason I say that, because the storyline of the book of Daniel takes place over a period of 70 years, and Daniel is still alive at the end of that period. All right, so if he's 20 in chapter 1, he's got to be 90 at the end of the period, or maybe even a little older, because it might go a little bit beyond 70 years. So you know, he can't be much older than 20. So I'm just going to say he's 17, 18 years old in chapter 1, something along these lines. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being the same. And they are captured by the Babylonians, but they have been a part of the royal family even in Judea. So we can imagine what their life was like in Judea. They didn't have to want for much. I would say that's sort of the definition of the cushy life that they grew up with. Now they have been captured and taken to Babylon, but even in Babylon, they are singled out as potential servants to Nebuchadnezzar, and that's the reason he goes for these boys. Well, they have already been in sort of royal training, and so they can be my servants in my courtiers. They can be in my court and serve me. And so he picks them out. And as we read through chapter 1, we see that, what we should not imagine is that they were living in some sort of a dungeon, being thrown scraps of bread and water or something. It's not captivity like that. recently watched this PBS series, a masterpiece series called Wolf Hall. Y'all should absolutely watch that. Now, it's also a lot about death and stuff, but not nearly as much as silence. It's a lot more fun to watch Wolf Hall, but it's about Henry VIII. Henry VIII. All right. And, well, it's really about one of his courtiers, Thomas Cromwell. Fantastic series. But they show Henry VIII's daughter. At one point, he's got his oldest daughter is Mary. She is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And she is in, quote unquote, captivity at some point. And of course, she's got like the fanciest dresses you can imagine. And she's living in some sort of royal apartment. And she gets all the fancy foods and everything. But she does not have freedom of movement. So she's in captivity in that sort of sense. You know, it's not as free as she would like it. She lives a cushy life in captivity. Well, I'm going to say, looking at Daniel chapter 1, it looks like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego live a pretty cushy life in captivity. They're living a pretty cushy life. They're getting all the perks. We can imagine that a bunch of these Judeans were taken into captivity and they were not given all these perks, and they are living a pretty hard life in Babylon. But not Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They get this, all the training. They get all the schooling they want. They're living in the king's quarters. And then the food. And the food is where the problem comes in for Daniel. This is in verse 12. This is chapter 1, verse 12. He says, please test your servants. He's talking to the servant set in charge of them. Daniel says, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations, and deal with your servants according to what you observe. So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every respect of literature and wisdom. Daniel also had insight into all visions and dreams. Now, I'm going to stop reading there. Daniel says, I only want to eat the vegetables. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are right there with him. We're only going to eat the vegetables. The king wants us to eat all this rich, sumptuous food and the wine, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to do vegetables and water. And then it says, after the end of 10 days, these 4 Jewish boys were fatter than all the other boys. Now, the text doesn't explain how that happened. And I'm not sure I know how that happened. And I think maybe you have an explanation, but I don't know if your explanation is right. I can think of a couple of different, I can think of 2. Like, maybe you can think of more than that. I maybe lack imagination. But I can think of 2 explanations for how did they end up fatter on that diet. Let me just highlight the problem. Usually we don't say, oh, you're only going to eat vegetables? Boy, you're going to get fat. Usually we would not say that. That it would be the opposite of that, right? So how does it end up that this is the case? And of course, I do think we should probably understand fatter in like maybe a different kind of sense, just like, well, beefy. I don't know exactly what the word is that we want here, but fatter in a good way. Obviously, it's good. They're all very happy with the result in Daniel chapter 1. But how did that happen? Look, I mean, I can think of basically two explanations. Either it's just the natural process of eating better food, or it's a God thing. I tend toward the second explanation, that in fact, eating the king's food is probably the more natural way to get bulky, if that's your goal. Eating the vegetables is probably not the more natural way. If that's what happened, it's probably the case that God did that. That this is some sort of a supernatural result, not a natural result. Now, part of the reason I'm saying that also is because of what we read just right after that. God, I think, supernaturally did give these boys wisdom and skill in all kinds of ways. That's not natural. That's something God did for them. It's not just a process of their schooling. And in the next chapter, think about that. That's Daniel chapter 2. This is the dream, Nebuchadnezzar, of that statue made of different kinds of metals. And nobody can figure out, what is this dream supposed to mean? And Daniel goes up and I'll tell you what the dream is supposed to mean. And listen, the way I know is God gave it to me. There's nothing natural about it. It's supernatural. I don't know if that's exactly what's going on with this diet, but that's my suspicion. My suspicion is it's not a natural thing, it's a supernatural thing, is what has happened. Daniel has decided to be pious, more godly, more devoted to God than most people, and so God has decided to bless Daniel. It seems to me that's, look, I don't want to argue with anybody about it. If you think it's a natural result of the diet, that's fine with me. I'm not convinced of that myself. But here's really what I want to know. Why didn't Daniel eat the king's food? That's not explained either. What does Daniel have against the king's food? And wine. Now, I say you can't eat certain food in the Old Testament, and you think, well, yes, of course, pork and food laws and that family of 7 boys and the mama, that's what they were doing. They refused to eat the king's food because it was forbidden by their God. Is that what's going on in Daniel chapter 1? It doesn't say, but I have my doubts. I have my doubts that the problem is that the king is shoving pork at them. I don't think the king is shoving pork at these guys. Now, if you know anything about Jewish food laws, you might say, well, it doesn't have to be pork, but even if it's beef, even if it's chicken, there are special kosher ways of preparing it. And maybe that's what Daniel had a problem with. Maybe they weren't preparing the beef or the chicken in the correct kosher way. Well, look, you're reaching for it there. I mean, that's a stretch. Okay, because first of all, what are we talking about? We're talking about rabbinic laws of preparing kosher meals. That didn't come for hundreds of years later, okay? So I doubt very seriously there was any such thing as those sort of kosher ways of preparing beef or chicken in the days of Daniel. That's one thing. But the second thing is, what about the wine? Okay, yes, today, if you go to a Jewish supermarket, you can find special kosher wine. So there is such a thing as kosher wine as opposed to non-kosher wine. But again, that's modern. That's not biblical. They didn't have any such thing as kosher. You look through all of Leviticus, where all these food laws, there's nothing at all about wine in there about that. Deuteronomy, nothing. It's got food laws, can't eat pork, can't eat shellfish, can't eat all kinds of stuff, vultures and whatnot. Nothing about wine. Why wouldn't Daniel drink the wine? Well, the text doesn't say, so all we can do is take guesses, but some guesses might be better than others. I'm not checking my texts. I'm just checking the time. I suppose I have to the hour, is that more or less? 8:30?
When listening to you quit talking, Joe.
Okay, all right. Why wouldn't Daniel eat the king's food if it wasn't a kosher issue? Why wouldn't he drink the king's wine, which was definitely not a kosher issue? Why did he limit himself to vegetables and water? Look, I've heard people, I think this is a pretty good guess. I've heard people guess that maybe he wanted to identify with the poor Judeans who weren't getting all the special benefits that he was getting. Okay, maybe so. Maybe so. That would be a nice thought. I think that works. I have another thought that I think works also. You notice in this passage that Daniel, the king is trying to turn Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into a good citizen of Babylon. That's the whole point. That is what the king is after. I got to get these Judean youths to turn into good citizens of Babylon. And so it says that look at verse, let's see here. I'll start reading in verse 4. Young men without physical defect and handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, competent to serve in the king's palace. These are the people you need to go get. They are to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. They were to be educated for 3 years, so that at the end of that time they could be stationed in the king's court. Okay, so 3 years, we're going to educate these people in the language and literature of the Chaldeans. We are going to train them into being good Babylonian courtiers. And a part of that is the king's food. And it looks to me like what Daniel has done is he is saying, look, I will accept learning the Chaldean language. I'll do that. I will accept learning Chaldean literature. And maybe I'll be able to serve in some good way here in Babylon if I learn these things. But I am not going to become a good Babylonian citizen. That's not who I am. I am a servant of the God of Judah, and I will always be a servant of the God of Judah, and there is no way I am just going to conform to Babylonian society. So I think he picked something. I am going to hold Babylonian society at arm's length. I am not going to embrace it. I know a lot of Jews around me are just embracing Babylonian society because it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, they think. But I am not going to do that. I'm going to hold it at arm's length. So I'm going to pick something. I'm going to pick food. And I'm going to divorce myself from what these people want me to do with this food, so that, not that the food is sinful, it's not. Not that the wine is not sinful, but I am going to divorce myself from this aspect of Babylonian society, so that I know, and everybody else knows, I'm not just a Babylonian citizen. I'm somebody different. And I know there's going to come a time when that is going to matter. When all of the Babylonian citizens start doing this that I cannot do. Now, eating the king's food, that's not a sin, but I'm holding it at arm's length because there's going to come a time when it is a sin. Bowing down to a statue. You can only pray to this king for 30 days. Whatever. Eat this pork. There is going to come a time when push will come to shove. And I'm going to have to make a decision. And it will be a whole lot easier if that decision has already been made a long time ago. And so you get to chapter 3 and a threat of a fiery furnace, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't even blink. They are not trying to make a decision right now. Are we going to be good Babylonian citizens, or are we going to be servants of God? That decision was made years earlier with something as silly as the food they chose to eat. And you get to this point where Daniel is threatened with being thrown into the fiery furnace, not the fiery furnace, the lion's den, and the decision about what he is going to do has already been made. He has lived a lifetime holding Babylonian society at arm's length. That missionary, Portuguese missionary to Japan, Rodriguez, in the novel Silence. He's captured by the Japanese, and they're thinking, how can we get him to renounce his faith? And there's a point in that novel where they have him captured, but they're not doing anything. They just have him captured. And they give him some freedom of movement, and what they really do, they pump him full of food. He eats well. He eats better in captivity than he ever did on the run in Japan, trying to evade his political opponents. And at some point he reflects on this. Are they just trying to make me weak? Are they trying to break down my defenses? Are they trying to make me soft so that it will be harder for me to resist when they really come in and put the screws on? America is the richest and most prosperous society in the history of the world. It's a nice, comfortable time to be alive. Until you reflect on the parable of the sower. And you think about that seed that went among the weedy ground. And the weeds came up. And what were those weeds? The deceitfulness of riches, the pleasures of this life. Daniel decided the pleasures of this life are not going to be the weed that comes up and chokes my faith. I'm going to hold this society at arm's length, not picking out some sinful thing. Of course he wasn't going to do the sinful things, but picking out something that was so very tempting, just innocent about society, and saying, no, I'm not going to do that. And in that way, I think he provides a pretty good example for the kind of faith we need to live as well in this society in rebellion against God. I beseech you, brothers, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Be not conformed to this world,